Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Adoni. I'm with Platypus at the Oregon State University in Corvallis, and this is a special session on that came out of the summer reading group. So some of you were part of the summer reading group that Jason led on utopian socialism, but also then the preliminary weeks for the main reading group, and we just to stay on schedule and to start the school year, we missed the week on Hegel, and so Jason agreed to provide a teach-in on Hegel, and if you've seen some of Jason's teach-ins in the past, he did one on left communism. Jason often takes a real expansive view, so I think this is going to be really great for us. For some of the people who've joined the leading reading group late, I think it's a part that's missing is the bourgeois revolutions, and we've come up against the bourgeois revolutions multiple times in the second half of the reading group, but we really haven't given it its full measure. And so Jason's going to be trying to achieve multiple things here today. Jason, which chapter are you currently with?
I am with no chapter right
No
now. I'm in
chapter.
Florida. I'm in like the panhandle of Florida, and there's nothing going on here. There's no platypus chapter. It's strip malls and highways, so it's pretty dead out here. So I wouldn't expect there to be a chapter out here. I know there is chapters in Florida, but I think they're located in the cities. I'm not in a city, so I think they're more south. So yeah, I'm kind of just free floating right now. I still consider myself part of like the western end of platypus, even though I'm out here on the east. But that's my engagement with platypus. Me getting into it was I was originally part of the San Francisco chapter, so that's how I know the West Coast members was going it through that way. Um, I don't know what's up with the San Francisco chapter. I don't know if anybody else knows or if Anthony, you've been keeping up with them. I hope it's been thriving. But yeah.
I'm not sure. The one thing I just wanted to say before we get started, though, that we had envisioned this as being a Pacific Northwest kind of teach-in
Mhm.
with the Portland chapter, but also the one at Oregon State University. But more recently, there's a chapter in Seattle. And so I don't know if any of the Seattle participants are here, but we thought it'd be good for all of us who've been siloed within our chapters just to recognize that we have, members all the way up into British Columbia. And it is we're starting to develop in the region, and it offers opportunities for engagement, especially in a place like Seattle, which really we have not, there's a strong tradition of the left in Seattle that we really haven't engaged ever. So this is really exciting times in the Pacific Northwest.
I'll also say I do think the West Coast chapters, I think they're the most promising, but the ones that need the most development in the organization. And what I mean by that is, at least from my experience in the Bay Area, it's very much a matter of like there is tons of radical left wing history and radical left wing groups. And so it's a really rich source to draw from and a really like rich ground to like engage with. But the flip side of that means that it has been harder for platypus to actually get established because we're competing with so many radical groups, so many Marxist Leninist groups, or even like the anarchist scene was huge out there. And so it's like it's kind of catch 22, where it's like this should be like the best place where platypus should like thrive, but like it's just doesn't have much oxygen to like work with. That makes sense. It's just constantly being crowded out by all these other organizations. I don't know if it's that way where you guys are too, but that was my experience in the Bay Area.
Well, I will say, speaking of the Bay Area, Kevin is now on in Santa Cruz. So I want to give the floor to Jason. We're looking forward to your teaching.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, this is pretty expansive. So I wrote a lot and it's too much. So I'm gonna see how much we can cover. No, so my understanding is that kind of the focus really wanted to be more on like Hegel because you guys missed that reading. So I do want to make sure I give enough time to cover that ground to really engage with Hegel and specifically that the text you guys were supposed to read but you didn't read. I think it's a very important text to understand. I would recommend everybody go read it if you haven't yet. But with that said, if I was just to read what I wrote from the beginning, I would never get to Hegel because there's a lot of things I want to like the background of what's leading to Hegel. I want to make sure I get that clarified. So my approach right now, I'm going to read what is kind of like the introduction of what I wrote, and then I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to see if there's any questions you guys need, and then I want to kind of like take it piecemeal, more going to improv it in terms of highlighting the developments that I think are really important rather than getting too much in the nitty gritty. I originally wanted to get really into a lot of the history of the bourgeois revolutions. I'm not going to do that so much. If there's questions on specific bourgeois revolutions, we can save that to like the question segment of the teach-in. Um, I do think those are really important. The bourgeois revolutions are really what we're talking about here. But I'm coming at the bourgeois revolutions from the kind of like a theoretical approach to it, meaning I don't want to just like narrate the events of these bourgeois revolutions, however important those are. I want to make sure that people understand how the Enlightenment philosophers thought of these revolutions, how it drove their thinking and their philosophies, and how that's determined the world we live in today. All right, so with that said, let's see here. I'm going to read this kind of introduction that I wrote. All right. Okay. In Platypus, we treat Marxism as a sort of lost doctrine, a message in a bottle that, without our vigilance, is at risk of being lost forever. This is because the basic presuppositions and premises of the teachings of Marx have been forgotten by those claiming to be Marxists themselves. The most basic premise being the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. Because this distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism has largely been eclipsed with a shallow flattening of the two into each other, we in Platypus have made it our mission to constantly reiterate this point. In fact, the distinction finds its historical basis in what Eric Hobsbawm has called the dual revolution that marks the profound transformation of the world between 1789 and 1848. That is, the French Revolution of 1789 and the contemporaneous British Industrial Revolution. So, just to clarify real quick, this period between 1789 and 1848, that's really like that transition. What goes on there is kind of what this teaching's kind of about. Now, obviously, I want to come at it from a Hegelian point of view, helping you understand like where Hegel fits into that transition, right? Because we're really talking about the transition from Hegel and Marx. Hegel is going to be the thinker of 1789, of the French Revolution, of all the bourgeois revolutions. He's a culmination of all of that. And then Marx is really going to be the thinker of 1848 and everything that comes after that. And that profound transition within that era is what's going to define today, like the world we live in, right? So the world we live in today, with its continual political and economic crises, is the result of not just these two events, that is the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, but perhaps more importantly, their repetition in degraded forms, like a loop we remain stuck in, and which is driving the regression of society into barbarism. Of these two terms that constitute the contradiction at the heart of capitalism, bourgeois social relations, and industrial forces of productions, this teaching will primarily focus on the first, more specifically its historical development. And in this regard, it really functions as something of a prologue to a much more substantial and lengthy analysis. Hegel famously said that the real is rational and the rational is real. This has usually been interpreted to mean that whatever is, how things actually are in their current state of affairs, is exactly how they ought to be, their ideal form. And one must recognize the extent to which this was a radical statement at his time to fully appreciate it. And certainly there are plenty of passages one can cite from Hegel to justify this dominant interpretation. But as the young Hegelian Chizowski has observed, and we read him during the last summer reading group, this formulation has largely been misunderstood. For this formulation demands the correction that both the rational and the real are only results of development. That is, at certain stages of the spirit, the rational coincides with the real, so that afterwards one goes beyond the other dialectically and reciprocally. From that, the epochs of disunion in world history originate. The real constantly makes itself more suitable to the rational, and this developmental process of both only separates itself into two parts in order to coincide again at a higher stage. This is the movement of the dialectic that Hegel is famous for essentially, I wouldn't say inventing because it's there throughout all of the bourgeois revolutionaries and all the bourgeois philosophers, but articulating in a way that wasn't possible, or maybe that wasn't as obvious before Hegel came on the scene. So both Hegel and Marx understand world history in terms of the progressive march of absolute spirit, that is, human consciousness, towards its own freedom and self recognition. And its self recognition is its own freedom. The two are the same. More importantly, for our purposes, both understand these moments in which the spirit is obscure to itself as historical periods of spirit self contradiction. Reason and reality diverge. For both thinkers, this self contradiction meant that history was in a profound period of transition to a higher stage. The self contradiction pointing beyond itself towards a higher potential, an Athenbung, which translates as sublation or supersession. Hegel, of course, was well aware of such dark ages of spirit's obscurity throughout history. And of course, Marx saw his own times as a sort of dark age, pointing beyond itself towards socialism. Okay. However, there is something fundamentally new about the obscurity and self-contradiction of Marx's in our times, which we in Platypus, following the Frankfurt School, registered with the term regression. Nietzsche called it nihilism. Hegel was well aware of the barbarism that plagued human history, which he likened to a slaughter bench, and clearly saw the threat of a return to this barbarism with each advance of the world spirit. But the historical providence that he and other Enlightenment philosophers saw unfold with the development of bourgeois society suggested the real possibility of finally arriving at a state in which mankind has left that barbarity behind for good. What Hegel had announced as the end of history, absolute spirit finally recognizing itself in its freedom. And yet a new kind of barbarism has arisen with the development of the capitalist mode of production, the self-contradiction of bourgeois society. This barbarism and obscurity of spirit, however, does not mark the failure of the Enlightenment project. On the contrary, it was born from its complete success. What is attempted here, and hopefully in a novel way, is an explication of that new barbarism that Horkheimer and Adorno named as inherent to the dialectic of the Enlightenment. A barbarism that is not simply a return to old forms. For what must be grasped as new in this barbarism is the fact that it has arisen out of the project to do away with barbarism in toto, an unforeseen consequence of the Enlightenment project itself. A new kind of barbarism has arrived after the purported end of all barbarism. This is what is meant by the term regression, not just a mere repetition of the old, but a repetition with a difference. To understand these new tendencies which turn cultural progress into its opposite, It is first necessary to understand the original project that sought to overcome man's mire in stupidity and violence, fear and laziness. The question then becomes, how exactly should we understand this original project? One way of approaching this question, and here I hope is where my originality lies, would be to explicate the extent to which the example and model of the bourgeois, that is, Enlightenment revolutions, determine the Marxist conception of revolution. While it may not be immediately apparent how doing so would provide us with the answer we need, the point would be to see both the identity and the difference between the two. To measure the nearness and distance between them would be to bring to the foreground that differential remainder that is the mark of our times, that malaise of modernity, varyingly called regression, nihilism, or from a more conservative perspective, decadence. This is so because revolution is a bourgeois phenomenon par excellence. Bourgeois society, in its conception and reality, is a permanent revolution. A fact that is obvious for anyone familiar with the USA, a country in which bourgeois society has developed more fully than anywhere else, where political power is systematically overturned every 4 years, and each succeeding generation grows up in a very different society than their forebears. To assert that our task today is still revolution is to admit that we have not yet finished the Enlightenment project. The bourgeois revolution has yet to reach its destination. But the crux of the matter consists in analyzing why this is the case, why the Enlightenment remains an unfinished product. Modernity has brought on a crisis the likes of which mankind has never seen before, precisely because it's a crisis born from nothing ever seen prior. The culprit is something utterly novel in history, affluence and abundance itself, i.e., the new modern phenomenon called alternatively either society or the economy. The social, political, and economic conditions of our Enlightenment predecessors were nothing like what we have today. This fact must be kept in mind. Contemporary society and its crisis is a historical condition that the Enlightenment philosophers would not have recognized in their own present or past. However, it would be wrong to think that the crisis we face today stems from an incomplete realization of the Enlightenment, as if its political project suffered from arrested development. On the contrary, our current crisis is born from the unwitting aftermath of its full success. The transition that occurs between the French Revolution and 1848 is the key passage of time that explains this shift in paradigm between the Age of Enlightenment and modernity, between the bourgeois paradigm of revolution and the Marxist one. For while revolution in itself is a specifically bourgeois phenomenon and notion, the working class struggle for socialism nonetheless constituted a profound change in paradigm of this phenomenon. Edmund Wilson, in his book To the Finland Station, which we read in Platypus, tried to register and conceptualize this break with his notion of a second enlightenment that culminates in Marx and Engels. For what defines the common trajectory of those thinkers who fall under this rubric of the second enlightenment is precisely their grappling with this failure within success, defeat within victory that characterize the outcome of the first enlightenment. Undoubtedly, the French Revolution, the last of the great bourgeois revolutions, in some way prefigured and helped spawn this new socialist paradigm. But how it has done so still remains obscure. Therefore, we must analyze the unfolding of its profound drama as the historical chopping block that divides the revolutionary tradition in two. If the American Revolution represents the epitome of the bourgeois paradigm of revolution, its crowning achievement, then the French Revolution provides us with the nascent forms of a new one from which the very notion of the left was born, and yet it still remained a bourgeois revolution in the end. How are we to understand all this? The inherently bourgeois character of the notion and phenomenon of revolution can be most clearly seen in the common trope put forward by the more politically radical philosophers of the Enlightenment of the right to revolution, i.e., the right of a people to dissolve and recompose their government when that government oversteps the boundaries of human dignity and becomes despotic. The assertion of this right has gone hand in hand with an analysis of that almost mythical state of nature that is the beginning point of all natural law and social contract theories. This is because the concept of the state of nature both functions as a measuring stick to gauge where and when a people's natural rights have been trampled upon, as well as a conceptualization of that period in a revolution when the old order has been overthrown, but a new one has yet to be fully established in its place. Every revolution must pass through a sort of every revolution must pass through a sort of zero point of sociality and legality. This is what was once called the state of nature by the bourgeois philosophers. In a parallel fashion, and this is important, this is kind of the whole thesis of my teaching. In a parallel fashion, the development and progress of consciousness too must pass through a zero point of knowledge, what Hegel identified as the necessary stage of skepticism. The two parallel tracks meet in the concept of enlightenment put forward by Kant as a process of maturation and autonomy, that is, of freedom. So just to really emphasize that point, the parallel tracks there that I'm talking about, right, is the development of consciousness and also the development of bourgeois revolutions. They both go through this zero point. And when it comes to bourgeois revolutions, it's a zero point of legality, of sociality, of there is no legal regime anymore. There is no definite social bonds holding society together. It's a state of where something new can come out of. And Hegel also saw the same process going on with the development of consciousness, where consciousness has to go through the zero point of knowledge, where it questions everything. In the same way that, like in a revolution, all institutions get questioned. All institutions are thrown to the throes of skepticism. And with Kant's notion of enlightenment as a process of maturation and autonomy, we can see the necessity of having to go through this moment, through this point, this zero point, as a way to reach a new level of maturity, which means freedom. All right. I'm assuming you guys read the Kant piece on enlightenment. All right. I'm going to continue here. This overlap marks revolution as a process of enlightenment in the development of consciousness, though more precisely in a particularly collective form of consciousness as a process of mass maturation. This becomes clear when we look at the two most important bourgeois revolutions, the American and French revolutions. A comparison of the two, however, brings to the fore not only their shared presuppositions and goals, but also their differences in the uniqueness of the French Revolution as prefiguration of the developments that will turn the Enlightenment project on its head. There is a reason why the notion of socialism first arose out of the French Revolution, though the latter clearly remains within the bourgeois paradigm. Okay. That's kind of the basic gist of my introduction. I'm going to read this last paragraph to kind of start the transition into what will be a discussion, hopefully. All right, but what exactly is this bourgeois paradigm of revolution I am referencing here? What are its conceptual component parts? I want to focus on three specifically here. This will not be an exhaustive count of this paradigm, nor am I claiming these three conceptual components to be the main ones. Rather, I focus on these three because of how they are transformed or recede from the picture when the new socialist paradigm arrives, which is to say they will help us understand the transition from the bourgeois conception to the socialist conception of revolution. So these components, these three components are: one, the state of nature, which we've already mentioned; two, the reconciliation of the collective and the individual, a kind of short circuit between universal and particular; which finds its most elegant expression in Rousseau's general will. And three, what I'm going to call a double articulation of mass revolt on the one hand, which is usually social in nature, and an intellectual political project of enlightenment on the other. All right, so that's kind of the basic introduction of it. Before I go further, is there any questions, anything that comes up right now? Because from here, I'm going to get more specific about the historical developments that I kind of just introduced.
Well, all right.
I have I have one quick question, and it might be you might get into it in. So I was a little hesitant on asking it because you might get into it in a second. So you can tell me if not. And me and Adoni kind of were talking about this discussion or this topic specifically, but I guess this difference in Hegel and Locke in like how they relate to each other because they're both writing about and on the bourgeois revolution, but one kind of seems at the end of the British Revolution, where the other one is like the American and the French, and kind of their difference in their relationship between each other.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because that is exactly where I'm going to go next. So I was going
Okay.
to begin with Locke, but I think you kind of pointed out the essential components there is where Locke is at the beginning and Hegel's at the end. So, all right, this is great. This is a great way for me to kind of start into the specifics of this. So, really, this, how can I put it? All right, what we're talking about here is really when we talk about the bourgeois revolutions, we're talking about a bourgeois subject that has become revolutionary. Okay, the bourgeois subject has become a revolutionary subject. Now, Locke is the person at the beginning of that process. Okay, so you really can't understand Locke if you do not know the Glorious Revolution, the English Glorious Revolution. All of his writings, everything, even his like ones that seem purely epistemological, they're all an ideology. They're all a justification for the Glorious Revolution. And he is specifically fighting against Hobbes. All right, so I'm assuming people know these philosophers, at least their names, Hobbes versus Locke. So, just in the way that the Glorious Revolution is the event behind Locke, the English Civil War is the event behind Hobbes, right? So they got two different moments that they're writing in. They overlap. I think Hobbes dies pretty soon after the Glorious Revolution happens. So he experiences that, but he's pretty much at the end of his life. I don't think anything was written by him during the Glorious Revolution. Locke is really beginning his career leading up to the Glorious Revolution and after. And the way that they experience their respective events is going to completely determine how their philosophy is going. Now, the important thing to remember is like Hobbes and Locke, they are setting the boundaries of bourgeois ideology. Like the political parameters are set by these two. And what's going to become the conservative position is going to be set by Hobbes, and what's going to become the radical revolutionary position is set by Locke. Okay, so what's the distinction here? Let me see if I can pull this up. I'm going to try to abbreviate what I wrote. So a lot of it is actually around this concept of the state of nature. In fact, there's really two notions that are going to be crucial, and they have to do with the three component parts that I'm talking about for a bourgeois paradigm. One is the state of nature. The other one is public good, what constitutes public good or the common good. Okay, so when it comes to the state of nature, Hobbes is the first modern bourgeois philosopher to articulate the modern conception of the state of nature. Now, the notion of the state of nature precedes Hobbes. It actually it plays a role very different than what the bourgeois philosophers are going to take it up as. Now, what makes Hobbes a bourgeois philosopher or a bourgeois ideologue is that he's using the state of nature in such a way as to argue for a conception of political power, of sovereignty, that does not refer to divine right. Okay, so if anybody knows kind of the history of this stuff, the medieval conception of sovereignty relied on the idea that the kings and queens were descendants of God himself, right? Meaning Jesus Christ, or really like Adam and Eve, right? That they actually were descendants from Adam and Eve. Locke's first treatise on government, the whole thing is about disproving this. He's just trying to say, like, there's no way we can tell, like, if they actually were descendants of Adam and Eve, and even if they were, like, the descendants and the parents have no claim on the children. The descendants have no right to any of the power that the parents have. It all starts afresh every time there's a new generation. The whole first treatise is about that. I'm not really dealing with that. I'm going to be talking about more about the second treatise where he talks about the state of nature. But Hobbes himself is not referring to divine right when he's trying to understand the power of the sovereign. He's actually referring to the state of nature. And he's saying that the state of nature is essentially a state of war, of civil war, right? He's living through the English Civil War. So he actually has a real historical reference, a real reality that he's referring to. And it's the Civil War he's living through. And he's saying that's a state of nature. And Hobbes is going to make the claim that, like, that state of nature as a state of war is something we always need to ward off, and that therefore we always need a king, a sovereign power above us to make sure we do not revert back to that. Now, when we get to Locke, he makes this really radical move where he actually decouples the state of nature from the state of war. And he makes the state of war actually a matter of, like, civilization, right? Rousseau is going to take this up. He's going to radicalize this position. Right? And we're going to get to Rousseau. But so Locke is very much saying, no, like, actually the state of nature has nothing to do with war or civil war. Actually, in the state of nature is where we actually see the natural rights of mankind come forth. Hobbes as well talks about the natural rights of mankind, but they are all kind of subservient to the interests of the king, because for Hobbes, we get out of the state of nature and form a commonwealth only when we transfer our natural rights to a sovereign, a king, to a particular individual, such that the public good aligns completely with that particular individual, that sovereign, that king. Locke, on the other hand, completely rejects this. He asks the question, if it's not about divine right, and nor is it about might makes right, meaning that, like, the strong dominate the weak, then what does that leave us in terms of what constitutes sovereignty, political power? And he's going to say it's the people themselves. That the people who make up a commonwealth, they're the ones who determine what actual political power is. And therefore, they can revoke it at any time, right? If the people that they've elected to represent them, whether that be a king or a parliament or, like we have today, a senate or anything, they always have the right to revoke that as the second that sovereignty oversteps its boundaries and starts encroaching upon the natural rights of mankind that are determined within the state of nature.
Jason, there was a question or a comment from Cedar about the 0 point and how,
Yeah. Okay.
Cedar, I don't know if you want to say it out loud, but
Yeah, I was just reading something the other day pointing out how there are a lot of various fantasies in American culture, and I'm sure you've encountered this in kind of mainstream culture, non-super politically active people who are like fantasizing about the end times or the apocalypse and society's gonna collapse,
Yep.
and just how this is like a fantasy that people have because they aren't imagining a future other than capitalism. They don't believe we can have something other than capitalism, but they obviously desperately want capitalism to end. They're fantasizing about the collapse of society just to end capitalism, which
Yep.
kind of sounds to me like that 0 point concept. They're fantasizing about getting to the 0 point so that some kind of revolution could happen. They just haven't gotten to the point of think about what kind of society we would want to build out of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you're drawing the right connections. So that imagery or that fantasy, that framework, yeah, it's harkening back to this notion of the state of nature. I mean, they're obviously not, they don't have to be conscious of the fact that that's what they're harkening back to. But because we are all bourgeois subjects, because we live in bourgeois society, this concept is inherently at play in all of us. I mean, you have to understand, like Locke himself referenced America as an example of the state of nature at his time. He's writing in the 16th century. And he's like, well, you want to know what the state of nature is? Just look what's going on in America. Look at the Indians, right? The 0 point where like there's no legal laws, there's no like um, social institutions yet, right? It's just kind of a free for all, everybody against everybody type of thing. He's like, yeah, look to America. So this is deeply ingrained in our psyche in a way that we probably are not even aware of, right? And if you think about the frontier days, right? Like, I mean, so I kind of, this is the point I want to make about the state of nature that I kind of raised this in what I wrote. It's a tricky concept because if you try to think about like the ontological status of it, like its reality, it functions in two ways. On the one hand, it sounds like it's an account, like an anthropological count of like how mankind began and how it transitioned into government, right? And that, in that sense, it may be completely inaccurate, but that's not really the point, right? By the time you get to Rousseau and even Hegel, they're going to call it a philosophical fiction, meaning it's a necessary presupposition in order to get to the political points that they want to make. But that doesn't mean it's not real. Once again, the reason why I brought up the fact that Hobbes is living in the English Civil War, and he points to that as an example of the state of nature, as well as Locke is living through the Glorious Revolution, is that there is a reality to it. The point really is that how to think about it, it should be thought of as like a virtual point, like a via negativa, right? We talk about this in Platypus quite a bit. Rousseau is very specific about this. When you get to reading him, he's like, what's the state of nature? Let's subtract all social conditions of civilization. Let's just take it all away, right? And see what we're left with. And that's the state of nature. And the point is like that should be the virtual point that we're either like getting closer to or we're like retreating from. Right? Do we ever get to a point of pure anarchy? No, of course not. There's always going to be some little element of like social organization, but we're either moving forward and backwards towards it. The reason why I don't know if you guys read the list that I sent out. Well, and he sent it out. I sent it to him and he sent it out. The reason why I included the Benjamin piece on the critique of violence is because he's really good about this point, right? He says like there are really only like two different kinds of violence. He calls it divine violence or mythical violence. A violence that destroys the state, returning you back to like a state of nature, or a violence that builds up the state, right? That leading us back to a more authoritarian state, right? And so that trajectory of going back and forth from this virtual point of like, you know, the 0 point that I'm talking about, that's really the importance here, right? Like that's why it can play a role in fantasy, right? Because we can always think about the way that what would it look like if all the laws and all the institutions that we take for granted have like suddenly dropped out. And that's the thought experiment that these bourgeois philosophers are doing. And the point I'm trying to make is that the difference in the way that they conceive these, or this, like the difference in the way that they conceive the state of nature, it's not really about which one is true and which one is wrong. It's about what's the political project behind them, right? The way that they conceive the state of nature has two diametrically opposed ideas of what a political project should be, right? The way Hobbes thinks of the state of nature, for him, it's it's what justifies absolute power. Whereas for Locke, for him, it's what justifies the resistance to absolute power. It's what justifies the right to revolution. And that's what's at stake in this concept. Does that make sense? Or does that answer something, I hope?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to take both of those justifications from this idea of the state of nature and think about them as opposing forces that are at work in
Yes.
nature. They're contextually, they seem like opposed, but they're possibly contextually true to each of those philosophers' experiences. And we are like constantly coming up against this force of um, like authoritarianism, essentially, like the consolidation of power and the resistance to the consolidation of power.
Yes.
Well,
Yes. No, that's exactly it. And when we get to Hegel, he's going to synthesize both of these, right? He's going to be able to show how like they're both right. I don't want to jump ahead too much because you know, but yes, that's exactly you're right about that.
I quickly want to just say, like, I think there's another conceptualization of the state of nature that is not totally antagonistic to those, but incorporates more of the present understanding of collaborative systems in ecology.
Oh, I would love to hear that.
Um, just kind of like the idea of ecological systems being not necessarily strictly in competition, whereas like in a forest, you
Oh,
might say the trees are in competition with each other, but they are also involved in a network of sharing resources
yeah.
and all depend upon each other.
That would be more Lockean. That would be more at the Locke end of things. Yeah, Locke's going to go there. He's going to say the state of nature is what provides the basis for a commonwealth, right? So yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll also say this too, like you can probably, if you study anthropology, I mean, like, okay, let me back it up. This concept of the state of nature was so important to all of these bourgeois philosophers and bourgeois revolutionaries. Robespierre talks about it constantly, and yet it drops from the rhetoric of not just like academia, but like of revolutionaries themselves after essentially the French Revolution. It plays a very crucial role in this in the French Revolution and how they conceptualize it. And then afterwards, it just drops off the face of the earth. I mean, Hegel takes it up, but he's already starting to transform it into something. He's already criticizing it. And by the time we get to Marx and the Marxists, they are not talking about the state of nature anymore and how to conceptualize revolution. And that's kind of one of the points like this is what I'm trying to talk about here in terms of like something has changed during this period. And yet, this concept of the state of nature, it still has echoes, right? Like there's still something comparable to what we're talking about today with it. Just like you raised up like the fantasy we have of the apocalypse, right? Like it still lingers. We just don't feel like it's the right terminology to use because the way I like to think about it, and this might be really very, very much like a speculative move I'm going to make. I feel like in their embrace of the state of nature, these bourgeois revolutionaries came to realize just how unnatural mankind is, right? That like it just doesn't really make sense to talk about nature in this way anymore. And instead, we really get like with Marx, like the term regression kind of replaces it, right? That he feels like, Marx says, this is what he's trying to tell us is like the reason why we need a revolution is because we have to go through regression. In the same way that the bourgeois philosophers like we need to go through the state of nature in order to start something new, right? It becomes a state of emergence, right? It starts becoming a state of emergence rather than a state of nature.
So Marx also kind of just in general talks about the evolution, the evolution of capitalism into socialism, and I was reading briefly that he was pretty influenced by reading Darwin and reading about biological evolution. And I guess I'd want to sort of suggest that maybe the discussion of the state of nature as like this specific state that like could be returned to or has a fixed nature, maybe it stopped being talked about that way because we started conceptualizing things as in a constant process of change and evolution instead.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that the idea of the 0 point, which is what the state of nature was, is that they thought that had to be returned to in order to have a change come about, right? Because it's literally like the way Locke puts it, and Locke talks about the right to revolution in this way. He's like, if if the sovereign is despotic and it oversteps its boundaries and it starts encroaching upon the natural rights of man, then it is incumbent upon us, the people, to return to a state of nature, overthrow the king in order so that we can have something new. The point is that like as a 0 point, like you constantly have to go back through it in order to progress, right? It's a circle, right? That's the idea of it is you coming out of the state of nature, and then you have to return back to it if you want something new. And that's how they thought about revolution. All right. There is a cyclical aspect to it at the same time that it's linear, right? It is something, they are trying to create something new, and they just feel like they have to return back to that state where all institutions have been kind of like brought to the ground. Start fresh.
Could I ask a quick question?
Please.
Did all the philosophers believe that revolution would automatically lead to newness, or that the 0 point would automatically lead to something new? Is it this assumption that if we can return to that point, then inevitably something will happen, rather than a return to what
Very
it
well.
was?
I mean, once again, that's I try to draw a distinction between Hobbes and Locke for this reason, because yeah, Hobbes did not feel that way, right? He was on the listen. Hobbes and Locke, they are setting the political parameters of what's going to be a conservative and a radical point of view that we still have today. So if you're talking about the conservatives, right, the reason why like today they are against socialism because they just think it's going to return back to the anarchic state of the state of nature and lead to nothing better. That was Hobbes' position. And so there are Enlightenment philosophers who follow this strain. Edmund Burke, right? He's going to argue against the French Revolution, right? He's taken up this position of Hobbes, a conservative bourgeois position, right? It's not a conservative medieval position. He's not arguing to return back to medieval times and slavery. Like they do believe in bourgeois values, but in a conservative way, right? In the same way that like today we have conservatives who are going to be promoting freedom and equality and all this stuff, but they do not believe that we can attain socialism. They just think it's going to lead to anarchy, to this lawlessness state, right? Where it's just all versus all. That's the way Hobbes formulates the state of nature. He says it's the war of all against all. And he believes very strongly that like this must be avoided at all costs because it leads nowhere. So yes, there are going to be different bourgeois takes on this, whether you're coming from the conservative or the radical angle. Now, for the radical angle, yes, they do believe that you have to go through this, right? Except to when you get to like Hegel. Hegel's going to be a little bit of a different beast. He thinks that, how can I say this? He thinks Germany doesn't have to go through the French Revolution. He thinks the French Revolution was necessary, but now that we've been through it, Germany doesn't have to go through this 0 point of revolution, that we can just build off of it. You know, whether he's right about that, I mean, who's ever going to know? Because suddenly things change very quickly after Hegel. Even during Hegel's time, you're starting to see the effects of the Industrial Revolution in a way that he can't fully comprehend yet. I hope that answers something of what you were trying to ask there.
That absolutely answered it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, once again, the more important point is that how they conceive, like it's not about whether this conception is right or wrong, right? It's more about how they conceive it defines a politics behind it. How they think about this concept has two very different types of politics. And what's at stake is the notion of like absolute power, absolutism. Okay. Was there any other questions before I see like there's a lot of writing going on? Am I missing questions here?
I think Matthew had one. Oh, and he also unmuted.
Yeah. So, um, maybe Hobbes gets more into this in his later chapters, but um, w when I recall reading from Hobbes is his arguments towards absolute power are definitely weaker than his arguments that there needs to be some sort of state, right? Because his central argument, as I understand it, as to his justification for the state of nature is fundamentally the equality of mankind, and
Yeah.
specifically the equality of mankind in their resistance to death.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if the,
That's key right there. Just want to say real quick the resistance to death. But go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, um, I'm curious if the other Enlightenment philosophers have other thoughts on what's what's the equality come from? What's the axis that we have equality, and is how does equality connect to the state of nature?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up because I'm not reading from my text, so there's just going to be tons of points that I'm just not going to get to. But that's a huge part of it. So the defining state of the state of nature for all of these philosophers across the board, these bourgeois philosophers, whether they're conservative or radical, is that the state of nature is a state of equality, right? That's really where this notion of equality is going to come from. That if you take away all the laws, take away all civilization, everybody is fundamentally equal, right? You may be stronger or weaker, sure, but like you're ultimately, there's no artificial constraints on you to have somebody above you or not. It's really just about, it comes about like force against force. You should be
Yes.
hearing Marx in that, right? What happens when right meets right? Force decides.
Mhm.
Marx is gonna put the state of nature right at the center of capitalism. But that's really what's going on here.
Mhm.
And so, okay, I'm glad you brought up the resistance to death. So really what's driving the state of nature? Like what is it that, how can I put it, the motivating factor if you're returned to a state of nature and why everybody is essentially equal is because self-preservation is the fundamental motivation of everything.
Mhm.
Right? And there is no reason, there is no justification why somebody shouldn't try to self-preserve themselves. That's going to be the argument for the state of nature, right? That everybody has a right to self-preservation. That's the kernel that all of them share, right?
Mhm.
And then the politics behind it is that they're going to draw very different conclusions from it. So for Hobbes, the right to self-preservation very quickly turns into just petty self-interest, right? So
Mhm.
Hobbes has a conception of the nature of man that is essentially a secularized version of original sin.
Mm.
Okay. He thinks mankind is brutish. I mean, I got a quote in here.
Yeah, solitary, poor, nasty British in short.
Yes. Okay. So meaning, right, for Hobbes, it's the finitude, it's the finite nature of mankind that's going to determine his politics. The resistance against death, right? The
Mhm.
fact that mankind is largely just fearful and submissive and corruptible, right?
Mhm.
That's the defining characteristic of man that for Hobbes is going to determine all his politics. For Locke, it's the exact opposite. For him, the defining characteristic of man is his infinite potential. It's his freedom,
Mhm.
specifically the freedom of labor.
Okay.
Life, liberty, and not life, liberty, and property. It gets turned into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the American Revolution, we can get there. But for Locke, it's life, liberty, and property. And property is based on the right of labor. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like, it's just, they're using the same concept, but it's like two very strikingly different worldviews that are going on that has a real stakes in politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say this enough. You can't understand Locke if you don't know the English Glorious Revolution. Like, he is just writing a manifesto for that revolution.
Yeah.
The second treatise is just a manifesto for the Glorious Revolution. It just is. Even his work on epistemology, it's just a manifesto for that revolution. Like, it
That
really
might
is.
be why I didn't understand Locke when I first read it.
Yeah, I didn't either because they don't teach it that.
Yep. I just got it taught as a contradiction to Hobbes, and yeah.
Yeah, they're not showing the actual political stakes of what's going on there,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how can I put it this way? Like, him as an ideologue for the Glorious Revolution, the predominant argument that he's trying to make is for religious toleration, right? Because what he's facing under James the Second, King James the Second, I'm not going to go into the history of how he came because that has to deal with all the English Revolution, and we'll get bogged down into specifics. But when James the Second comes to the throne, he has an agenda of trying to bring back Catholicism. England at this point is Protestant, right? Keep in mind, for these people, religion is so determinative. Like, it's in every aspect of their life, their politics, their social existence, their economy. Religion just permeates all of this. And so Protestantism versus Catholicism is not just about religious beliefs. There's real politics behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why James II wants to bring back Catholicism is because Catholicism, and he's looking towards the French king, right?
Yep.
Louis the 14th, because France is Catholic, because Catholicism represents absolutism. It represents the absolute power of the king. Protestantism is a challenge to that. And so James II is looking at this as like, if I can bring back Catholicism, I will therefore have more power. And I don't have to deal with Parliament because there is a Parliament at this point, right? That comes
Yeah.
out of the English Civil War,
Yep.
the Magna Carta too, right? Like, so like
Mm-hmm.
he's having to contend with power and he's trying to bring back Catholicism. And Protestantism therefore represents religious toleration. It represents the idea that there has to be a check on power. Locke was part of this capital D dissenters movement. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to bring it up. This book right here, if anybody can see, Revolutionary Politics and Locke's two treatises of government, right? It's a huge source I've been using to deal with Locke. And it just goes completely into detail to all of this, the whole politics behind it. It's fascinating. It's by Richard Ashcraft. Maybe I can send out an email later. Maybe I could just type it in here. But the whole point of it is that, like, all of these things, like the state of nature, Catholicism, Protestantism, they all have real political stakes that are like that. They're just the heart of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's driving the Glorious Revolution. That's going to lead to the Glorious Revolution, right? The fact that they're at war with the Netherlands, with Holland, Locke is exiled there.
Mm.
All right. So, all right. I don't want to go too deep into that. It could take up the whole hour. Is there any other questions? Does that help in some way?
Yeah.
Any other questions before I keep going? All right. All right. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I want to really get to Hegel. We got an hour left. Okay. So I brought up this notion of the public good, that's playing out between Hobbes and Locke, right? Hobbes identifies the public good with the private interests of the king. Okay. For Hobbes, you have to have a king. It's what constitutes a commonwealth. If you overthrow the king, you're overthrowing the commonwealth. For Locke, it's the opposite. The public good, on the contrary, is the commonwealth itself. It's the people themselves, and which is not constituted by the king. The king is constituted by the people. You hear resonance with this with Marx too. Okay. So that's really what's at stake here. Okay. Who constitutes what? Is it the people that constitute the king, or is it the king that constitutes the people? And that determines what this idea of the public good is. Now, Locke's use of the public good is going to lead to Rousseau's general will. And Rousseau's general will is going to lead to Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is also in turn going to lead to Hegel's absolute spirit. You can just put like an equation mark between these guys. Okay. All right. Locke's public good is Rousseau's general will or general interest, meaning it's an interest of society that goes beyond each of the private members. It's beyond the private interests of the members. It's the interest of the whole collective in general, which has a life of its own, which that's what the invisible hand is. And that's what absolute spirit is for Hegel. And Locke is the one who's going to say what's driving this public good is labor. Okay? It's the fact that mankind labors, which is why society, right, the people themselves, can generate their own public good out of themselves. Why they don't need a sovereign to dictate what's good for them. And that's what's going to lead to this whole trajectory that will end with Hegel. And what I want to get to is the master-slave dialectic of Hegel. And so you can really understand what that's about. Well, let me ask you this. All right. Anthony or anybody, we only got like an hour left. Is that right? Am I correct about that?
Under the common consent, we have 1 hour scheduled, but I'll hang up.
So should I just go directly into Hegel, you think, at this point, and skip some steps here? Like, I guess my dilemma is that I have a very overreaching broad narrative that I'm trying to get to. And I know you have a very specific agenda of like, you guys didn't read Hegel, therefore we need to make up for that. Is that like correct, my assumption in that?
I think there's a lot that we have people who have been through the reading group and have missed the Hegel. Then we have people here who have not done any of those. So the broader, I would think, would be useful. The broader overview.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I second that. And then, yeah, plus for us who have been through the reading group, I'm sure a refresher wouldn't hurt.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I hope I made it clear the political stakes of what's going on between Hobbes and Locke. I'm going to leave that behind now. There's a lot I could say about that, but we're just going to leave it behind and really focus on this idea of the public good, which is leading to Rousseau's general will. All right. So what's at stake here, right? I'm going to go back to the three component parts of the bourgeois paradigm that I'm talking about. Once again, it's not exhaustive. There could be more that may not be even the most significant, but they play an important role into understanding what has changed. So we talked about the state of nature. The other one is the short circuit, or this reconciliation between the collective and individual. Okay. The way that the individual good and the public good can align, right? That they don't have to be in contradiction with each other. That's what Rousseau's general will is really about. Now, you will get a lot of conservative accounts where it will say the opposite, where it privileges the collective good over the individual. But that's not really what it's about. So the collective good, the general interest of Rousseau, it certainly is a beast of its own that goes beyond just the mere adding up of all the private interests. So there is that aspect of it. But however, it does generate from the people themselves, right? When he talks about the general will, it's very Lockean in the sense that he's saying that like that's what constitutes sovereignty. The transference of or the representation of any politician to work on behalf of the collective good only gets their power from the people themselves, right? And so that's why it essentially kind of takes on a life of its own that's going to become Adam Smith's invisible hand. Now the idea is if everybody kind of pursues their own interests, a common denominator results from it, right? And that common denominator is what Locke called the public good, and it's what Rousseau calls the general will, and then we're going to get to the invisible hand, right? This is also Hegel's absolute spirit. So what do I mean by that? Hegel's absolute spirit. All right. The good always wins in the end. You can kind of say that. That no matter how much evil and self-petty interest is at play in humankind, if you let society itself pursue its own course, the good, the public good, will always win in the end. That's the basic idea of it. When we get to Hegel, he ontologizes this, meaning he makes the absolute spirit into its own kind of active operation, ontologically, right? Such that, like, it has to, what can I say? Human beings just become the corollary of this absolute spirit itself, meaning the good is always going to prevail, and it prevails through human beings themselves. It wants to reflect back onto itself. It wants to understand itself. It wants to reach self-consciousness, and human beings are the vehicle by which it can do that. So you're seeing from Locke to Rousseau to Smith, there's other Kant's in there too, to Hegel, this real radicalization of this notion of the public good. Such that by the time that it gets to Hegel, it's like an entity unto itself. And it's the driving history. And he's able to do this only retrospectively. And he's very, very clear about this. Like Hegel isn't, he's very aware of like his own operation. He knows it's retrospective. And he's only able to say all this because history has ended up where it has ended up. And what's driving all of this is the freedom of labor. All right, so this is where I want to introduce the master-slave dialectic. Does any, like, have you guys are familiar with this? You guys know the master-slave dialectic somewhat? No?
I've heard from people it's not Hegel's.
No, it is. Who told you that?
I hear people say that it's like like a different like German idealist. Like I want to say like Schelling or something. You know, they'll say it's Schelling and it's not really Hegel.
Yeah.
I will throw in that there are people like Andoni says on a whole bunch of different levels. You might want to throw in what the dialectic is, or like
Gotcha.
a quick, and then go into the master slave, so people can kind of get these comparisons.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. All right. All right. So what is the dialectic? How can I put this? Okay. Do you remember back when I was talking about when I was reading my introduction, and I gave you that formula by Hegel? The real is rational, and the rational is real. And I said that there's a misunderstanding here if people just interpret it to mean that like the way things are is the way things ought to be. The dialectic is essentially these two terms, the rational and the real, in this kind of endless dance of meeting up and departing, and meeting up and departing, and meeting up and departing. And every time they depart, it's the condition for a progression to something at a higher level. All right. We are living in a profound period where the rational and the real are very divergent. Like we have been practically a century down the road now, longer than a century, where the rational and the real have not met up. And that's telling us that we are in a profound period of transition that we have gotten stuck in. So this is what I meant by when I say when the obscurity of spirit, when we can't rationalize what our historical spirit is, that it's obscure to us, that maybe we don't even have one. For Marx and for Hegel, that's a symptom of the fact that we're in a period of transition that is pointing beyond itself. The rational and the real diverge from each other. When they align, like they did for Hegel, right? That's why he's going to say we're kind of at the last stages of history. We're at the end of history. What he's saying is that, like, finally, all of this makes sense. Everything that we've been through now makes sense. It's clear to us why we had to go through this slaughter bench of history, and we've come out on top. Look, remember, he says history is a slaughter bench. He's like, it's just fucking evil. It looks horrible. And yet the good predominates. All right, we have to nowadays flip that around, right? Hegel had a positive dialectic. We have a negative dialectic. So for Hegel, you can pursue your self-interest, which could be the most evil self-interest, and yet you will end up with the common good. Today, you can pursue the most common good as much as you want, and you will end up with evil. Meaning you can have the best intentions to try to make society better, and yet we are constantly finding ourselves in just a crisis. So that transition to that period, I'm going to table that for a minute. Let's just really think about Hegel for a minute. And why would he think that? Why would he think that no matter all of the evils, all of the bad impulses, all of the destruction, all of the slaughter bench of history still ended up with the common good of mankind prevailing? So this gets to the heart of his master-slave dialectic. All right, I'm going to outline this dialectic. Just keep in mind it's going to be a bit shoddy because I'm summarizing it. You guys should, I recommend you guys read it. All right. So we're in the state of nature, and two people meet each other for the first time. This is the first time they ever met anybody before because they're in the state of nature. Just like Rousseau says, the vast majority of time people who are in the state of nature, they're isolated, they're solitary, they don't meet anybody. And finally, they come across somebody. Let's just say it's two men, right? And their first interaction with each other, their initial impulse is that they want the other to recognize their autonomy, to recognize them as a subject. Well, if both of them want to be recognized as autonomous subjects, this creates a conflict because in order for one to be recognized, the other has to be degraded. The other has to be, say, I'm lesser than you and that you are the autonomous subject. Essentially, one has to be degraded to an object. So a struggle ensues, a struggle to life and death ensues, war ensues. And this is the brilliant point of Hegel, I think. He says, well, There are two options here. One person is victorious. And if he's victorious, that means one of two things. Either he's killed the other person or he's enslaved the other person. He's dominated the other person and he's made the other his slave to do what he wants. Either way, it's a self-defeating victory. Let's suppose he kills the person. Well, the dead person can't recognize him as an autonomous subject. It can't recognize his freedom because he's dead. So the victory at that point is like a brief moment where he can say, I've succeeded over the other. I've succeeded to dominate him, now killed him. And yet he's back at the same position that he started with. He doesn't have another subject to affirm his autonomy. All right, the other option is that he dominates the subject and makes him a slave. Well, that too is self-defeating because he hasn't found another autonomous subject to recognize his autonomy. Instead, what he's got is an individual that he's reduced to just an object who certainly does recognize his autonomy, but it doesn't mean anything because this other individual has proved himself not worthy of being able to recognize autonomy. He's reduced to just one other object among other objects. Should be important to emphasize the fact that this dialectic of the master-slave arises after Hegel has explicated the dialectic of object and subject that happens in consciousness, right? The consciousness of an animal. Does an animal recognize objects for what they are? How could they? They don't have language. It's this dilemma that runs up with the idea of just consciousness that isn't self-conscious yet, right? This consciousness that will see an object but can't recognize the object for what it is because it has no words to express it. It's what happens when you try to think what an animal consciousness must be like, right? Do they understand that this cup is a cup? Do they understand that I am who I am? They kind of do, but they kind of don't. They could not formulate it. It's this aporia. And then what happens is two subjects meet each other, two human subjects meet each other, and finally it creates the conditions now for self-consciousness. Because what happens is, let's just say that in this battle that's occurred, he doesn't kill the other person forfeits, right? Which means the other person values life over death, meaning he values life over having his autonomy be recognized, right? And if you guys have ever read anything about ancient civilization, this is how they rationalize taking slaves. They go, in a state of war, we're fighting another nation. If somebody doesn't kill themselves at the prospect of becoming a slave, therefore he's inherently a slave. Because me as a master would never allow myself to be a slave. I'd rather die than be a slave. Arendt talks about this constantly. This is like a real thing that is in like, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's what separates masters and slaves. That's how they consider that they would rather live as a slave than die as a master. So let's suppose that happens. And he takes the slave, and he doesn't get the satisfaction really of being recognized as a master, as in like an autonomous individual, because now he's stuck with somebody who he just regards as just one object among others. Here is the crucial point that Hegel is going to make. In the long run, the slave becomes the master. Because in the long run, the slave is the one who actually works on the land, on the earth, on human culture. He's the one that actually makes things. The master only really consumes, but the slave produces, right? He's forced to. And this is where law originates. This is what that dynamic of positive law versus natural law. The positive law is really just the law of saying, like, I command it to be so. The master saying, this is law because I say it so, imposed upon the slave. As the slave progresses, I'm talking about like centuries here, right? Slavery, that condition, as he increasingly becomes aware of his mastery of nature, suddenly there's a transformation that happens where the slave itself becomes the master over the master. The master eventually just kind of fades. It's a dialectic only for the slave. For the master, he's kind of indifferent to this, but he ends up becoming nothing in the end, in the same way that we don't have masters today. It's a narrative about how we gotten to where we are now, meaning that like the slave becomes the master only to the extent that he shapes the world around us, right? He is the one that labors, that produces, that creates the human world. The master is only the one that actually consumes it. And in the end, what Hegel is saying is we've seen that the slave has become free. Labor has become free. The citizen becomes the predominant category by which the slave becomes free. Now, the point of what I'm trying to say here in terms of like positive law and natural law, if we consider positive law to be law as it is commanded by the master, natural law, in the way that all of these bourgeois conceived it, is rational law, meaning it's the way that they thought the law ought to be. Positive law is the way it is. Natural law is the way it ought to be. So the way that Hegel synthesizes Hobbes and Locke here is that he recognizes the extent to which positive law, law as command, I commanded as a master, necessarily had to be the very beginning of law. There would be no law if that didn't happen. But the becoming of that, right, the whole process of history is going to be transforming it into natural law, meaning the rights of man. Okay. He sees that whole trajectory as like, he calls it historical providence, or he says providence, but it means historical providence. He doesn't mean divine providence. That's what is in the text we're supposed to read, the introduction to the philosophy of history. This category of providence this is where it comes up, and this is where he really explicates it in terms of like, this is the becoming of history. Now, this is the important point here. Where does the master-slave dialectic fit in terms of the state of nature on the one hand and world history on the other? It's the transition point to one and the other, right? It has one foot in the state of nature and one foot in world history. He literally is describing the transition from the one to the other. And this is going to be important for Marxism. The violence of that master-slave dialectic is going to characterize human history throughout its whole duration. World history is stained by the violence of the master-slave dialectic. So when Marx and Engels say all of history is the history of class struggle, they're not affirming class struggle, they're condemning history.
Right.
Right? And when they say, violence is the midwife of history, they're not affirming violence, they're condemning history. This is why in Marx and Engels, there's this weird, like, what is the state of like communism or socialism? Is it post-history, or is it like the final beginning of history? There's this ambiguity there, right? Like, because the idea was, once again, with like Hegel and his idea of the end of history, is that we can finally leave this barbarism behind. we can leave this violence that has stained human history. And yet that didn't happen after Hegel, right? That didn't happen. Something went wrong. But that was the Enlightenment project. That's why I'm saying, like in the introduction that I read, they thought the barbarism that constituted human history, that slaughter bench of history, could finally be like put to rest. And so by the time you get to Marx and Engels, there's this like notion of like, well, maybe everything has been prehistory, meaning it hasn't been actually like real human history because it's been stained with this violence. Or is it the fact that we finally overcome history and we can leave it behind? It's like both, right? We're trying to leave the stain of the beginning of history, and yet mankind hasn't been able to do it. What we have been able to accomplish now has been to make that violence naked, to strip it from its religious veils, right? To like not give it any excuse of like, well, God ordained it or it has to be this way for whatever reason. It's just pure exploitation and violence at this point. And that's the opportunity we have to overcome it, right? That we can see it for what it is without any ideological veil. Okay, is there any questions from that? Does that all make sense? I feel a little bad because I skipped a lot. I just kind of went straight to Hegel there, but I think it's important that I get that in. We got like a half an hour left, so I want to make sure I got that in.
No questions or anything, but that was very well explained, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, I want to really just emphasize that the problem of history is the fact that it's the history of class struggle. Now, in Platypus, we kind of teach why that formula isn't quite correct because class struggle only really begins with the modern age that we're living in. The bigger point is that the class struggle that we experience now, because it's so naked, it reveals what history always was about. It's retrospective. It's revealing, like we can only now know that all of history is the history of class struggle because we live the class struggle now. They didn't live it that way. They didn't experience it that way throughout all of history, right? It was veiled ideologically with religion and all a bunch of other shit, but really religion was the predominant ideological veil at that time. Which is why Protestantism was such an important development for bourgeois ideology. Christianity, but also really Protestantism is really the condition that allows bourgeois society to grow. You know, Protestantism, remember, it has protest in there at the very beginning. When I'm saying like bourgeois society is inherently revolutionary, like, oh, that's what somebody asked me this, and I forgot to mention this notion of revolution, this modern notion of revolution versus the ancient notion of revolution. And this is important because the idea of revolution changes from the ancient conception to the modern. In ancient society, revolution really meant a revolving, right? It meant a return to the old. It's only in the Enlightenment modern era, the bourgeois era, that we get revolution changes its significance. It means something new. It means the creation of something new. That's a specifically modern phenomenon that happens. And I'll say this, going back to the three component parts, right? I talked about the state of nature. I talk about this reconciliation between the collective and the individual. That's the general will. The third one, this articulation between mass unrest and intellectual political project, that also changes nature when we get to today, when we get to socialism. So for the bourgeois era, the bourgeois revolutionaries, they were really like providing an ideology for a reality that was already happening. Okay. Meaning bourgeois society was developing kind of spontaneously on its own. And these Locke, I mean, even Hobbes, but like Locke, really the radical, like Rousseau's, Kant, Hegel, like all of those bourgeois ideologues, meaning bourgeois philosophers, they're really providing an ideology and a justification of something that's already underway. And by the time you get to the revolutions, they are just trying to essentially render in fact something that has already happened, meaning they're trying to render legally something that has already happened in society, right? That's why like they're all like essentially political revolutions, right? They're all just trying to say like there's this social phenomenon going on, this evolution and development of bourgeois society, and yet the legal and political sphere has not caught up to it. And so therefore we have to have a revolution to make it catch up to it.
I have a question.
Yep.
You mentioned Marxism as criticizing history or condemning it on the basis that it's the history of class struggle.
Yep.
Is that different than the way Hegel would have related to history?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a break.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, Hegel he did not foresee the class struggle that happened after him. And how could he? Right? I mean, he was right at the beginning of it, but he died before it really solidified. So that was another important element of my essay, was that like I really went into the French Revolution and how that like prefigured socialism. But it prefigured socialism. It didn't really establish socialism, meaning that we're seeing like these nascent signs of what could become socialism, but it doesn't really make sense in the historical context that the French Revolution was working in. It only makes sense later, after like 1848. It becomes solidified as like, oh, okay, this new thing is really the thing that defines our era. This is really like, this is an important point I wanted to make. And if anybody read the text I sent, this is kind of like why I picked the text. It's because in all of the bourgeois revolutions, even the American, to a less extent to the others though, but even in the American, there's a social revolutionary element of it that exceeds the bourgeois revolutions themselves, the bourgeois political revolutions. But they are doomed to fail. Okay? They are always doomed to fail because the historical context wasn't ready for them. But that like exceeding beyond their historical moment will provide the basis for what will become socialism in our era. Marx's whole point is like what was not possible then, but that will like bourgeois revolutions were constantly pointing towards, it's possible now. It becomes the task now. All right. That's why like in Platypus, we like make this provocative formula of like capitalism is socialism. Right? Meaning like from the very beginning of the bourgeois revolutions, it was constantly pointing towards what is now socialism, except it exceeded what was historically possible at the time. But it provided like the nascent signs of like what will become the basis of socialism, right? And specifically, I'm thinking about not just the French Revolution, but the English Civil War, which is really a revolution. Okay, they name it a civil war. Revolutions are civil wars. Not all civil wars are revolutions, but all revolutions are civil wars in some ways. And this civil war was a revolution. And the Glorious Revolution is just a continuation of that. It's one historical process going from the one and the other. And it's in the English Civil War that you get like the levelers, the diggers, you get Cromwell, all of this crazy, bizarre shit that like socialists are constantly referencing. But of course, it couldn't succeed at that time, right? It went beyond what was historically possible, as revolutions tend to do. Because revolutions, as a return to the state of nature, is just this opening up of like possibility of the new. And then reality comes in and checks in what's possible, and there's always a change that follows, but it always exceeds what's actually capable. And that excess provided the basis from which the socialists drew from. All right, that's we're talking about the second enlightenment now. We're getting to that now.
All right, James, you're up.
Yeah, kind of touching what you were just speaking on. You kind of pointed to the possibility that the American Revolution, or the fact maybe that the American Revolution was like maybe less social than other bourgeois revolutions. I just thought that was interesting, because I was just reading the Jameson this morning, and he talks about, and maybe he's kind of addressing like a misconception that exists, kind of in the scholarship or whatever, but he's talking about how in many ways he's kind of like kind
Yes.
of
That's why
drawing pointing out the continuity, right? Right. And I feel like in your presentation you were kind of trying to get at the uniqueness also of the French Revolution, right? But yeah, but then I guess, well, one thing I wanted to ask, I guess the thing I'll ask first, is I just have like Arendt in my mind, and my understanding of her conception on, the bourgeois revolutions is that she's in favor of the American Revolution, and not the French Revolution. I think it's kind of on this basis that it's less a social revolution, right? It's
yeah.
less, it's more kind of purely political, like the English Glorious Revolution, right? And I feel like this is kind of maybe a sort of standard, like kind of liberalish take, right? And I'm curious what you make of how Arendt comes at the issue. I was so surprised reading the piece, Tradition in the Modern Age or whatever,
Yeah.
just like in the sense, and for the same reason I was surprised at reading the Kropotkin, in the sense I was like, wow, it's hard to find Marxists these days who actually understand Marxism this well, maybe, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
right.
Yes.
And yeah, so I don't know. So I'm kind of just wondering like what you make of Arendt, Arendt's take on the bourgeois revolutions, um, and then I maybe have a question about Hegel, but I'll just let you answer that first.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, so Arendt has been very influential for me personally, specifically before I got into platypus. I've read Arendt pretty extensively in my college days. I'm 40, so like my college days was like a very long time ago. So, but that should give you some context of like it's there's been a lot of time before then, but she was very important for me, especially the human condition, which I recommend everybody read if you haven't. It's a brilliant book. And this book on the what is it the tradition of revolution, or just I think it's just called On Revolution, which is a very brilliant book. So that's actually, if I was going to go into like everything that I actually wrote, I'm arguing against Arendt here, okay? Because for those of you who haven't read it, Arendt's premise is that she pits the American Revolution against the French Revolution. Okay. And she favors the American Revolution. And the problem that she sees with the French Revolution is that it raises the social question. This is what I mean when I say, in some ways, it prefigures socialism to an extent that the others didn't. It's because the social question gets raised in the French Revolution in a way that it didn't in the previous revolutions, right? It just becomes almost a dominant trait at the end of the French Revolution. and also is kind of what leads to its downfall. So it makes sense why Arendt would poo-poo the fucking French Revolution and really like favor the American Revolution, because the American Revolution is probably the most successful bourgeois revolution we've ever seen. As James Vaughan says from Platypus, and this is a brilliant point, it wasn't a nation that had a revolution, it was a revolution that found a nation. The American Revolution is what he's talking about, right? Once again, it's not a nation that had a revolution, it's a revolution that founded a nation. That's really important to understand the American Revolution. However, with Arendt, though, why does she privilege that? Even Arendt, though, like what's the kernel of the American Revolution that she thinks is applicable to today? It's Jefferson's ward system, right? If you read the book, that's what she praises, and that's what she kind of says, like Jefferson's ward system, which is the Soviets. It's the Soviet system. She says it in there too. She's like,
It's just direct democracy, right? Like,
yeah, it's direct, but really, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat.
right, right.
So that's why Chris will say, well, for Arendt, she just wants the dictatorship of the proletariat and doesn't think it can go any further. Whereas Marxists think that's the transition to something further. Right. So that's and like even with Arendt, like she is pointing beyond the American Revolution when she adopts the ward system as like, hey, maybe this is something that like it could be the solution to the problems we have today, because she recognizes the extent to which the social question, which was predominant in the French Revolution, is actually the predominant problem we face today too. Right? Even though she still like favors the American Revolution, she kind of subtly says that like, well, but like we really can't just replicate that today because we are dealing with this social problem. Like she even like recognizes like, yeah, the French Revolution kind of does point beyond itself into what we're facing today. She just doesn't like it because one, I would say she's a liberal, right, a liberal conservative kind of. And then she makes this is the thing that infuriates me. She makes this distinction when she's talking about the council system, right? The Soviets. She's like, well, there's like this difference in personality between management and workers. You remember this? And she's like, well, there's a difference between somebody who is like has to deal with politics versus somebody who has to deal with like, just like labor. And that's like the basis that like forms her like, well, maybe this is why this council system is going to be problematic. And my whole point is that like, well, that's what the dictatorship of the proletariat is about. It's overcoming this contradiction. It's about like the workers having to work through that problem. And her as ultimately, I would say, a conservative, she thinks there's limits, ontological limits to what's really possible. That's what I'm talking about when I go back to Hobbes versus Locke. And Locke adopting a secularized version of original sin. He's going, there's only finite things that humans can do, they're limited. Versus Locke is like, well, the potential is infinite. That's what that distinction ultimately comes down to. That's what we're still living with today. Right? The conservatives are always going to say that, like, yeah, but human nature really can't go that far. If you try to go that far, it just turns into anarchy. Whereas revolutionaries, the socialist revolutionaries, they're like, yeah, but no, like we have to try it. We have to make that experiment. And we believe that something else can come from it. It may not be what we initially wanted or supposed, but something new will come from it that would be progress. I mean, that's why I got so hung up on like Hobbes and Locke when I was creating this paper, because it does just comes down to that.
Well,
But go ahead.
I also kind of wonder if it doesn't tie into your inclusion of Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, just in the sense that Well, I don't know. Just a thought I had is, and maybe this is unfair, but I wonder if that kind of pro-American Revolution, anti-French Revolution kind of liberal sentiment is, not ultimately kind of, kind of a lack of nuance and consideration around this question of violence in history. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's just kind of a thought I had. Maybe that's coming at it from a wrong angle, but
Yeah, I would be reluctant to say that about Arendt because she is a huge reader of Benjamin. Like she is. Like I don't know if you guys have any of the Benjamin collections. She's the one who put them together. She's the one who like she wrote an introduction to one of them. So, and I definitely see in her writings that critique of violence essay, that dynamic that he describes, she does incorporate that into her philosophy. I don't think with Arendt it's a lack of nuance. I really don't because she's brilliant. I really just think it comes back down to this basic distinction between Hobbes and Locke of like, well, what do you think human beings are capable of?
and you see Hegel as sublating kind of them both.
Sort of. So this is oh okay. I'm glad you brought that up because okay, this was the one of the important points I wanted to make. He does return to Hobbes. Okay, he returns to Hobbes' position in the sense that he does understand the state of nature as a state of war. Right, that's what the master-slave dialectic is about. They enter into war. However, he does it from the political position of Locke and Rousseau, meaning he's going to say that like yeah, Hobbes is right, it starts this way, but the dialectic of history ends up with Rousseau and Locke. You see what I'm saying? That's why like that dialectic of positive versus natural law, he's saying that like it has to start with positive law, meaning that like the law is what I command. I'm your master, you're your slave. It's completely arbitrary. But history is the progressive unfolding of natural law, meaning natural human rights, right? So that's where Hegel really is a culmination of the Enlightenment, but of the radical Enlightenment. He is a radical Enlightenment philosopher. He does endorse the French Revolution ultimately, even though he has his critique of it. Certainly, every Enlightenment philosopher did at that time. Even Kant, but they all really like the radical Enlightenment philosophers still endorsed it. Like that was the radical move that they made. They can go, yeah, certainly this some things went wrong with this, but we still believe in that project. Whereas once again, I would mention Edmund Burke as the opposite of that. All right. Which by the way, I don't know if you guys knew this, but like Edmund Burke got into a debate with Thomas Paine over this issue. Edmund Burke wrote his response to the French Revolution and he reinterpreted the Glorious Revolution. He says the Glorious Revolution wasn't really a revolution in the modern sense. It was about returning back to old standards, old values that we had. And that's where the French Revolution went wrong. It didn't, it wasn't that. They didn't have the tradition that we English people have. And then Thomas Paine, this happened in like, I think it was a newspaper that published all this. Thomas Paine writes a number of responses against this interpretation. And Edmund Burke is a bourgeois thinker, nonetheless. So we are in the parameters of bourgeois thought, but there is this political dynamic, this, like right versus left wing interpretations of these things. Does that help? I think I might get off track there a little bit, but
No, that definitely helps. That was super illuminating.
um, we got less than 10 minutes. Is there anything, anybody else has any questions, any lingering concerns before we wrap up? I hope I brought something to the table here. It's hard to tell
Oh,
because
yes. No, you did.
I did. Okay.
Yeah.
didn't really get into the Hegel text that you guys missed though. Should I talk a minute for that? If anybody else has any questions, that would be useful too.
I see Kevin moving around. I don't know if Kevin, you're trying to unmute.
Yeah, I
Okay.
am. It's to tell you what, Jason, if you're not done yet with the formal part of your presentation, I can just ask it at the very, very end.
No, ask it
You
now.
prepared a lot, so I think it's better that we might hear what.
No. Ask now. I want to know.
No, it's okay. It's actually specifically on Hegel, so I think it might be helpful if you said a bit about it, and then
Yes.
we use
Great.
that.
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, but it can wait until after, because you still wanted to talk a bit about Hegel, right? As part of
No. I have plenty to say about Hegel. I just need some direction in terms of what you guys need. So I
your.
would like to hear your question.
Yeah, so this is very much pitched at you, but with in mind that we have some younger people in platypus here in the audience, and that maybe I'm not even the main beneficiary of this question, is that I think when we were talking a bit before this teaching, you told me a bit about your interest in wanting to do a teaching on Hegel and the bourgeois revolutions. And so maybe you could say a bit about your particular interest in the topic. And I know right now, among a lot of, I think, young students, also intellectuals, and these first two categories, not necessarily leftists. And then let's add a third category of like avowed, fringe, contemporary leftism. There's people in all three of these groups who are interested in Hegel. Maybe you could speak to like your own interests and how you perceive other people are interested, are the same rationale, different rationale. Let me give a bit of backdrop to the question. Like, no one really thinks in a vacuum, even though there are people nowadays who say, oh, I'm interested in theory, the deepest theory there ever is. And that may have a bit of a perennial quality character to it. Oh, I'm interested in Foucault because he's deep, or I'm interested in Hegel because he's deep. But on the other hand, it's always a mirror reflection of one's interests in one's own time. And if I think a bit about the leftists in the baby boomer and maybe slightly older generation who were attracted to Hegel, I think of maybe two instances, one of which is Hegel as a means to recover a certain idealist dimension of Marxism and also the critical dimension that might have been lost with a crude productivist or crude materialist vulgar Marxism that was there under Stalinism and Dimat, whereas very affirmative. And so you kind of saw this sort of recovery of Hegel alongside with the recovery of the Marx 1844 manuscripts in the West. And then you also have a later moment in this new left baby boomer period with a lot of people who are nowadays like known as new leftist Hegel scholars. They went through the experience of the student movement, the Students for a Democratic Society, and they were Marxists or Marx-ish when they were students then. And when that student movement fell apart and they kind of grew up, Marx just failed, it just became less plausible to them, and someone like Hegel instead became more plausible to them. And so that's some really deep life experience in the context of the Cold War and also the New Left that, of course, us young people today, I think all of us included, even yourself and Andoni, don't really quite have that motivates a certain sort of reading or digestion of Hegel. And so, like, I was wondering if you might consider the analogous question for both yourself and, leftists, but also not other people, not necessarily leftists, maybe young students and intellectuals today, why they might be attracted to Hegel as a way of making sense of our moment. That was a mouthful, so.
No, totally. That's a great question. Well, in terms of my own interests, I mean, really, I started Hegel because I wanted to understand Marx, right? And I really don't think. And so this is where like the 1844 manuscripts played like a really predominant role when it came up historically because it reintroduced like a Hegelian Marx to people. And I do think that text is really important, the philosophical economic manuscripts, which we do read, at least sections of it in Platypus. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, so that's how it started for me. I wanted to know Hegel, and they do not teach that shit in school, really. When I went to college, I should say, they had one class by just a single teacher who would actually try to tackle it. And they read a lot of Kojève's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I hope you guys know who I'm talking about, the French theorist, right? Who Chris says is essentially a Stalinist. He knows more than me, so he's probably right. I read the Kojève's text. I read the Hippolyte text, which is really great. I recommend that. Chris may condemn me for that, as far as I know. Um, I'll say this. So, what Hegel represents for me now, right? So, I started with one intent. I started one intent to really understand Marx. I wanted to read Hegel and understand how Marx was influenced by Hegel, but also critiqued Hegel. Now that I'm very much more engaged in Hegel than I've ever been before. Um, he represents to me, well, one, the high point of bourgeois philosophy, but second, a corollary to that is the fact that like it just represents a very different world outlook than what we could ever have nowadays. The fact that he sees things as like history has gotten to the point where we can overcome everything that has determined it before, that's no longer an option for us, right? Like we clearly can't say we've overcome the barbarism, the slaughter bench of history. We're in the fucking thick of it in a way that Hegel could have never foreseen, right? This is why I mentioned when we talk about regression, it's not just a return to the past, right? It's not just a repetition of the past, it's a repetition with a difference, meaning there is something new about the barbarism we have today versus what Hegel thought of barbarism. Because our barbarism comes out of the project to be done with it, right? To me, that's the fascinating point. So Hegel represents to me kind of this really the culmination of this point of view, this worldview, this bourgeois ideology, if you want to call it that, and almost like a foreign country where it's like it just feels so different. It's kind of like I have to switch into a certain mentality to try to understand why Hegel would think the way he thinks, why he would say what he says. Like,
But
it's a good exercise in terms of like providing distance from our contemporary situation and giving us that critical stance, right? Because
right.
I feel like if all we see is what's going on today, right? We're not gonna. It's just gonna be confusing. It's gonna be obscure. Having Hegel be able to be like, well, this is how we actually thought things were at this point in society, then suddenly that relief, that contrast makes all of this, everything that's going on today, kind of make more sense. And I say that only with the caveat that like, yeah, you have to read Marx too. You know, like that's really coming from a Marxist perspective. Does that kind of answer? I mean, that's a
Yeah, it does. And let me maybe follow up and press
yeah.
on some things by being a prickly thorn. So, like, I could imagine someone who had gone through the platypus reading group or had, a very good teacher in Hegel outside of platypus coming away with much of the same conclusions you did, that he seems to be quite deep and challenge our own moment. But I thought it was interesting you didn't quite like reference any specific things that were going on in our moment of the last 5 to 10 years, like sure, like someone like that makes sense to you. I could also imagine someone like having gone through the platypus reading group, also like having a certain sort of Hegel is like the thinker par excellence. That's it. So maybe you could clarify in light of some maybe concrete events or things that have gone on in the last few years that kind of inform your answer, maybe in the background, or draw it out a bit more. That's the first part of a follow up. The second thing is that I'm also reminded of some contacts who've come around the Santa Cruz chapter, who at the coffee break and at the reading group over the last few years will say, oh, Heidegger is such a deep thinker, or Deleuze and Guattari, they're such deep thinkers with the bug on a branch stuff. And also, oh, Althusser and Marcel Mauss, and also Bataille, they're such deep thinkers about the accursed share and the criticism of the Marshall Plan. We haven't yet achieved that threshold in the 20th century. And to me, at face value, they're also raising an argument about deepness of some of these more 20th century, more openly anti-Marxist texts, as opposed to Hegel, who requires more of an ambivalent quality. And sort of how might you distinguish yourselves from other people making an argument about a perennial deep quality of these other texts that are raised by theory heads or young intellectuals, leftist students in that vein? How might you clarify the deep quality of Hegel relative to other figures that are raised in the sort of perennial theory category?
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, so a personal note in terms of my own history, my own intellectual history, I started out as a Nietzschean, Deleuzian, Bataillean, I don't know how you pronounce it, um, postmodernist. So I did start out with that perspective. I like to say I came at it ass backwards, meaning I came to Marxism ass backwards. I started out with all the typical, I'm a millennial, I'm an upper end millennial. So my teaching was the millennial experience. Chris goes into all of this shit all the time. And he's absolutely right in that when I went to college, it was an anti Enlightenment teaching that they taught me, right? And they even taught, I read Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, and they taught it as an anti-Enlightenment tract, right? And that's also how they taught Nietzsche. So I really got into philosophy through Nietzsche. That was my big thing. If anything, I'd say I'm trying to be a Marx scholar now. I'm barely an amateur Marx scholar now, but I am definitely an amateur scholar of Nietzsche. I spent 10 years of my life reading him. And from there, I went to Deleuze, Foucault, the whole postmodern trajectory of that shit. So I started there and I've end up here now in Platypus. So I hope people register that. Okay, so that that this isn't, it's not like Platypus doesn't reckon with that type of shit. It does. Okay, so the first point I would say that came up in terms of Hegel and Platypus, I would refer to Chris's essays on politics, right? And why people get so bent out of shape with them. So really, I really believe this. What Chris's essays, right? Like why not Trump? Why not Trump again? Or the Greenland essay, all the stuff, everything that's controversial about Chris. He's literally trying to say, well, let's take all of these, main actors, whether it's Trump, whether it's Bush in the Iraq War, any of these actors where all these disasters come from, let's take them at their word that they're trying to do good, that they really are trying to do what's best, the public good, right? Locke's public good, or the general interest of Rousseau. They are trying to do that, and yet they just constantly end up in disaster. Whereas the left nowadays takes a very cynical position of they always have ulterior motives. They're not trying to do what's good for the people. it's all about their own self-interest, right? And that misses the dynamic of what's going on today, right? So in the same way that Hegel says you can pursue your own self-interest, however evil it is or bad it is, and yet you end up going to be producing the good in the end anyways. It's the opposite. It's a negative dialectic today. Let's suppose that all of these political leaders are trying to do what they say they are going to do, and yet it ends up in disaster. That's the dynamic I think people really miss of Chris's essay. Of like he's not trying to like provide an excuse for Trump or something. He's trying to say, well, like, yeah, Trump could be very much doing what he says he's trying to do, and yet we're always going to end up disaster because the good has been hijacked by capital. Okay, so that the public good today isn't really the public good; it's just the good of capital. And so, no matter how much we try to do the public good, it just ends up being the good for capital, the accumulation of capital. And so Hegel is a great contrast to that, right? Like Hegel is the philosopher who's going to tell you the Enlightenment and everything that led up to it was about the public good succeeding no matter what. Today, it's the opposite. So I think Hegel represents a good contrast to that. Okay. Now, for the second part of what I think your question was about, it's really about those thinkers that you mentioned, those postmodern thinkers that I began with. They really come from Nietzsche. Okay. And Nietzsche is making the same point. This is why I had you guys read the Arendt text, right? She brings up the idea of the Second Enlightenment by Edmund Wilson. And I would say that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, along with Marx, are still part of the Second Enlightenment. And the Second Enlightenment is trying to deal with the particular failure of the First Enlightenment, which I called a failure in success or a defeat in victory, meaning that like it did achieve its goals and yet it produced the opposite of it. And so Nietzsche is trying to grapple with that with his term of nihilism as well, right? It's all about the Enlightenment and what the Enlightenment led to, right? And he links it back to Christianity, which I hope I try to make explicit that Christianity is one of the historical conditions that leads to the Enlightenment and the bourgeois revolutions. So there was a passage of Nietzsche's that I wanted to quote, but I didn't bring it up in this talk, where he talks about the state of nature and the conception that these bourgeois philosophers have. And he goes, really what they're providing with is, when they talk about the state of nature, is just an image of their Christian values. And they're projecting it back onto nature. Now, as a Marxist, I would say what they're really doing is projecting their bourgeois values. It means the same thing, essentially. My point is that Nietzsche is grappling with the same thing when he talks about nihilism. However, he doesn't have a category of capital and capitalism. But there is an alignment there where they are trying to grapple with that. And so all of these postmodern philosophers, they too are trying to grapple with the fact that the Enlightenment project failed, right? That they are failed in its success, right? Not that like it didn't succeed where it wanted to, it did. Just the fact that in its succeeding, it produced the opposite of what it intended. And they are trying to deal with that as well. However, I think those particular philosophers, Bataille, I don't think Deleuze you can really put that in the same category. Deleuze is, I know this is probably heresy for Platypus. Deleuze is a little bit of a trickier figure, but someone like Foucault, for instance, there's a very strict anti-enlightenment mentality there, right? A very cynical approach to enlightenment. But even with Foucault in the end of his life, right? He went back to the Enlightenment, and even Hegel, and he was like, well, there actually is something there. But that was their initial impulse, right? Was to be like, the Enlightenment failed and it produced these catastrophes. And the catastrophe that they are dealing with historically is Nazism. It's the Second World War. there's a very concrete thing that they're dealing with, right? They are like looking at it like the Enlightenment project just led to this to the Third Reich. That's all what they're trying to comment on. Why did the Enlightenment lead to the Third Reich? And so when I went to college and they taught Adorno and Horkheimer's essay, they taught it that way too, which is one half of it. The other half of it, though, is trying to say, well, nonetheless, we can't just give up on the Enlightenment project. There's something there that needs to be fulfilled still. But they didn't teach it that way to me. It was very much of just like the Enlightenment's bad. Does that answer somewhat? I don't know.
What? Sorry for also, we've gone a little bit long. I did want to give, if indulge everybody for one last question. Brian, you've had your hand up for a while. Maybe we can conclude with Brian's question. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it's just a quick question. So you were talking about this. I guess I hope I'm not misinterpreting like your view of like how this new history in a way that can be viewed back to Hegel, right? Um, uh, and so studying Hegel might be beneficial. So do you think like studying like either Feuerbach or is going back enough and understand this like cyclical struggle of histories?
Okay, yeah, I would definitely say don't substitute Hegel for Feuerbach. You want to go back and actually read Hegel. If that's, I mean, listen, all right, if you're going to go down the Hegel route, that's a very big task. And that's something you have to really commit to. He's not an easy philosopher. So I'm not saying everybody has to do that. I do think having some understanding of Hegel is important. Probably, I would say if you go through the wait, also bourgeois temporalities and cyclical, is it? No, it's not. Um, Although there is a cyclical element of all right. If you're gonna try, like I would say that the platypus syllabus does a lot of the work. Okay, it really does. All right, and if you read the Hegel text, the philosophy on history, you're gonna get enough out of that to be able to understand what platypus is trying to teach. So in terms of Feuerbach, and I would say all the young Hegelians, this is the transition period that I mean, I actually wanted to get into this with my essay, the teach-in. That is a crucial period where they're trying to grapple with what Hegel is talking about in their new reality. Okay, meaning that they're registering something has gone wrong, and yet they're still working within the conceptual framework that Hegel provided. So I would never discourage anybody to not read Feuerbach. Like definitely read Feuerbach. Definitely, I would say read as many of the young Hegelians as you're willing to do. And but you can only read Hegel to really understand them. At least some Hegel, right? Like at least I'm not saying you have to read everything of Hegel. That's a crazy task, but read the phenomenology. Definitely read the philosophy of history. That's his easiest read. I'd also say, I mean, the philosophy of right is really important as well. The logic is too, but the logic is a complicated thing. So maybe, I don't know. If it sounds like you're asking me, like, what can I get away with reading and get enough of it? That's a tough question. I really do think that the platypus syllabus, though, does a really great job with all of this stuff. I really do. I've been a staunch, um, what would be the word? A staunch supporter, I guess, or like advocate for the platypus reading group and that reading syllabus. I just think it does such a great job. It hones in on really all the points, and you're gonna get the main gist of everything. And then once you do that, once you go through that syllabus, go through it again, you're going to get more out of it the second time, and then start branching out where you think is necessary. You know,
Okay. Right.
yeah. I mean, Feuerbach's great though. Like that's a huge important moment in that transition from Hegel to Marx. So
Mhm.
that's what I mean by like the second enlightenment. I still would include Nietzsche and Kierkegaard in that second enlightenment, but they're coming at the end of it, the tail end. Marx is the high point of that second enlightenment, and the young Hegelians is really that transition period where they're really trying to work out what's new about their era, what has happened after Hegel, or like at the tail end of Hegel's existence that like isn't quite lining up with Hegel's philosophy anymore. It's like this rich area of like seeing what's new about the 19th century. All right. And that's all happening before 1848. And by the time you get to 1848, it's all solidified. I would say 1789 to 1848 is this profound period of like transition where like nothing's really quite stable. Right.
Mhm.
And the French Revolution is like prefiguring all of this to a certain extent. I wanted to get into this, so I'll just say briefly, just very briefly, is that you actually see the formation of the bourgeois class happen in the French Revolution. Notionally, like just like it's just beginning. It won't get solidified until 1848, but it's a political configuration. Okay, meaning that for the first time in the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie starts turning against the revolution. Okay, meaning it starts constituting itself as a class because of its economic interests against the revolution that's unfolded. You don't see that really prior to the French Revolution. That's what I meant when I said it prefigures socialism, is that for the first time you see the bourgeoisie is no longer a subject, it becomes a class. Very briefly, if you read the somebody brought this up and they just brought it up in the chat, and I'm glad they did, about Jefferson's ward system versus Burenati's or Babeuf's communism. You guys know, right? Babeuf, if you read the communism text, the reason why he calls himself communist, the reason why it's a communist project, is because in the French Revolution, the Paris Commune forms spontaneously. Okay, that's before Babeuf writes anything. It just forms spontaneously. They call themselves the Commune. And Babeuf is trying to save that moment against Thermidor, in which this economic interest of the middle class starts turning against the revolution and they start trying to undermine the commune. They're literally trying to get rid of it. And so that's the moment where history exceeds its potential. Because really, Chris is right when he says, like, the French Revolution, all it really could have been was a constitutional monarchy. Right? But there's always these moments in these bourgeois revolutions that exceeds what's possible. And that's the little kernel that's going to be the socialist revolution in the future. That's a decent point to end on, I think.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everybody for joining us. I guess this was our first Pacific Northwest kind of event, including Santa Cruz. So thanks for everybody for coming out. And for those of you who are in Corvallis, the reading group starts again on Wednesday. We're going to be covering the imperialism um, pamphlet. And Huang, you guys are also your reading group is starting up again next week as well.
Yes,
Or
it's starting next Wednesday, 6 p.m.
what are you guys on?
We're on what are we on, Ben?
Uh,
Failure of the
Yeah.
Revolution Week.
Okay.
Luxembourg. Luxembourg.
Yep, Luxembourg.
Important. That's really important.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I did a lot of studying for this, and I'm glad it was able to happen.
Yeah. Are you gonna
It was really good.
Work it up?
That's kind of my plan, but it turned into an immense beast that I have to try to tame right now. So we'll see.
I'd love to see that you were hinting at it, that you were going to deal with like the French Revolution and its aftermath.
Yeah,
I heard you were kind of bringing in threads of the reading group.
I was hoping we could get to that, but I realized I kind of went probably bigger than what was possible in a teach-in. So yeah, it is what it is. But I'm glad I touched upon it at least. We got.
You exceeded the bounds of the moment.
I did. Yeah, I did not get nearly as much as I wanted to get in there, but I got something. So I'm hoping you guys got something from it. Oh,
Yeah, it was really good.
It was great.
Yeah.
all right. Take care, guys.
I'm gonna hop off there. It's good seeing you again, Jason.
You too, man. I hope I see you guys, all of you again.
Thank you.
And platypus, don't fucking quit.
Good night, everybody.